The wheel gave out with a sound like a rifle shot, and Violet Lawson knew, before she even climbed down from the seat, that her afternoon had just turned into something far worse than a simple trip to town and back. It was late September of 1878. The sky over the Wyoming territory bruised purple with an early autumn storm rolling down from the Laramie Mountains, and Violet sat there on the buckled wagon bench with her hands still gripping the reins, staring at the wheel that had folded sideways into the rutted road like a wounded animal. Behind her, tied down under canvas, were the sacks of flour and the new lantern glass and the little tin of peppermint drops she had bought for her son as a treat, and now none of it mattered because she was 3 miles from her homestead and the light was dying fast. Of course, she muttered to the empty road. Of course it would be today. She was 26 years old, a widow for going on 2 years now, and she had learned in that time that the prairie did not care one bit whether a woman was tired or grieving or simply trying to get home before dark. The land took what it wanted and gave back only what it felt like giving, and today it had decided to take her wheel. She climbed down anyway, her boots sinking into the soft red dirt, and walked around to inspect the damage. The wheel had cracked clean through 2 of its spokes, and the iron rim had bent outward in a way that told her this was no simple fix with rope and prayer. She pressed her palm against the splintered wood and let out a long breath that fogged faintly in the cooling air. "Well," she said to her horse, a patient old bay gelding named Duke, "looks like we are walking." But walking 3 miles with a wagon full of goods and a storm coming was not a real option. Not with her son Samuel waiting at home with only Mrs. Perkins, the elderly neighbor woman, watching over him. Violet stood there weighing her choices, none of them good, when she heard the sound of hooves on the road behind her. She turned, one hand instinctively going to the small revolver she kept tucked beneath the wagon seat, because a lone woman on an empty road learned quickly not to be careless. But the rider who came around the bend was moving at an easy pace, not the gallop of a man up to trouble, and as he drew closer she could make out the shape of him better. Tall in the saddle, broad through the shoulders, wearing a weathered brown coat and a hat pulled low against the wind. A stranger by the look of him. Wyoming was full of strangers that year, men drifting through on their way to the railroad camps or the cattle towns further north, and most of them kept moving. This one slowed his horse as he came alongside her broken wagon and touched the brim of his hat. "Evening, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and rough around the edges, like a man who did not use it much. "Looks like you have got yourself some trouble." "I have got myself a broken wheel," Violet said, keeping her tone even, neither warm nor cold. "Which is a different sort of trouble than the kind you might be thinking of, mister." He almost smiled at that, she thought, though it was hard to tell in the fading light. He swung down from his horse, a lean gray mare, and walked over to look at the wheel himself, crouching down beside it the way a man does when he actually knows what he is looking at, not just performing concern for a woman's benefit. "2 spokes gone and the rim is bent," he said. "You are not fixing this tonight, not out here." "I had noticed," Violet said. He looked up at her then, and in the gray light she saw his face clearly for the first time. He was maybe 30 years old, sun-worn and lean-jawed, with eyes the color of creek water in shadow, and a scar along his left cheekbone that had healed pale against his tanned skin. He did not look dangerous exactly, but he looked like a man who had seen things, the way so many men did after the war and after everything that came after it. "Name is Clement Rhodes," he said, standing and extending a hand, though he seemed to think better of it when he saw her hesitate, and let it drop back to his side instead. "I am headed toward Larkspur myself. Was aiming to reach it before the rain, but that plan seems to be falling apart same as your wheel." "Violet Lawson," she said after a moment. "I have got a homestead about 3 miles up this road. My son is there with a neighbor, and I do not much like the idea of him waiting on me past dark." Clement Rhodes glanced up at the darkening sky, then back at the wagon, calculating something behind those quiet eyes. "I can take you," he said. Your mare there looks worn out, but mine has got some road left in her. I will ride you home, and I can come back for the wagon tomorrow with proper tools, if that is agreeable to you." Violet studied him for a long moment. It was not a small thing to accept a ride from a stranger on an empty road as darkness came on. Her husband, Thomas, had always told her that the West made people move faster into trust than they might back East, because out here you often did not have the luxury of waiting to know a man's whole history before you needed his help. But Thomas was 2 years gone now. Taken by a fever after a brutal winter storm caught him out checking fence lines, and Violet had learned to rely on no one but herself since then. But the wind was picking up and thunder rumbled somewhere far off in the mountains, and Samuel was waiting. "I would be obliged," she said finally, "though I will keep my rifle handy all the same if you do not mind." That earned her the closest thing to a real smile she had seen from him yet, small and a little crooked. "I would think less of you if you did not," he said. They unhitched Duke from the broken wagon and Clement tied the gelding's lead to his own saddle, and then he helped Violet up behind him on the gray mare, his hands steady and impersonal as he offered a boost, careful not to linger, careful to be proper about it. She settled behind him, keeping a respectable distance even as the horse began to move, and they rode that way through the gathering dusk, the storm growling closer behind them, neither of them speaking much beyond directions. By the time they came up the rise and Violet's small homestead came into view, lantern light glowing warm in the front window, the first fat drops of rain had begun to fall. The house was modest, built of rough-hewn lumber with a stone chimney at one end, a barn and a corral off to the side, and a porch running the length of the front that Thomas had built the year before he died, saying a woman ought to have somewhere to sit in the evenings and watch the sun go down. Violet had spent many evenings on that porch since his death, more often alone than not, watching the light fade and wondering how she was going to keep the place running through another winter. Mrs. Perkins met them at the door, a stout woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, and behind her, peering around her skirts, was Samuel, 8 years old and all elbows and curiosity, his dark hair a mess from a day of not being made to sit still. "Mama," he called, darting past Mrs. Perkins and down the porch steps despite the rain now falling in earnest. "Mama, your wagon broke," Mrs. Perkins said. "The whole wheel came off." "Not the whole wheel, just some of it," Violet said, sliding down from the mare with Clement's steadying hand at her elbow, an act so quick and practical that she almost did not register it as anything more than what a decent man would do. "This is Mr. Rhodes. He was kind enough to bring me home." Samuel looked up at Clement with the frank, unguarded assessment that only children seemed capable of, taking in the tall stranger, the tired gray mare, the scar on his cheek. "Are you a cowboy?" Samuel asked. "Something like one," Clement said, and there was a warmth in his voice now that had not been there on the road, the careful gentleness of a man talking to a child. "I have driven cattle up from Texas, worked a fair few ranches. Rode with the army some years back too, before that. Did you fight Indians?" "Samuel," Violet said sharply, though not unkindly, "that is not a polite question." "It is all right," Clement said. "I fought in the war, son, the one between the states, back when I was younger than I am now. I have seen enough fighting to know I would rather not see more of it." Something in the way he said it made Violet look at him more closely, but the rain was falling harder now, and there was no time for further conversation. She invited him to shelter in the barn until the worst of the storm passed, and he accepted with a nod of thanks, leading both horses toward the structure while Violet hurried Samuel inside. Mrs. Perkins lingered at the door, watching Clement's retreating figure with narrowed eyes. "You be careful with strange men on the road, Violet," she said in a low voice. "I know you are managing alone out here, but a woman alone is a woman men take notice of, and not always for good reasons." "He fixed nothing, wanted nothing, and asked for nothing but to see me home safe," Violet said. "I think I can spare him a dry barn for one night, Mrs. Perkins." The older woman sniffed but said nothing further, gathering her shawl and heading out into the rain toward her own small cabin a quarter-mile down the road, leaving Violet alone with her son, and somewhere out past the yard, a stranger she barely knew sheltering from the storm in her barn. She told herself she would not think on it further. But that night, as she lay in her narrow bed listening to the rain drum against the roof, she found herself wondering what kind of man rode into a storm just to see a woman he had never met safely home, and asked for nothing in return. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet sage and turned earth. Violet woke before dawn, as was her habit, and went to the kitchen to start the stove, only to find through the window that Clement Rhodes was already up and moving about the yard, checking on the horses, and by the look of the split wood stacked neatly by the barn door, he had spent at least part of the early morning making himself useful. She stepped out onto the porch, wrapping her shawl tighter against the morning chill, and watched him for a moment before he noticed her. "You did not have to do that," she said when he glanced up. "Figured it was the least I could do for the shelter," Clement said, setting down the axe. "Your woodpile was getting low. Man ought to earn his keep." "I did not ask you to earn anything. I offered you a dry place to sleep out of Christian decency, Mr. Rhodes, not a job." "No, ma'am, you did not," he agreed easily. "But I have got nowhere I need to be this morning, and a wagon wheel to fix if you will still have me for it. Figured I would make myself useful in the meantime." Violet studied him across the yard, the morning light catching the gray in his eyes, and found she did not have the heart to send him away, not when Samuel came bounding out onto the porch a moment later, already asking Clement a dozen questions about the war and about cattle drives, and about whether he had ever seen a real gunfight. They rode out together after breakfast, Clement bringing along a coil of rope and some tools from his saddlebag to retrieve the broken wagon. It took most of the morning to rig a way to drag it back using both horses, Clement working with a quiet competence that impressed Violet more than she wanted to admit. He did not waste words or motion. He simply worked, occasionally asking her to hold something steady or hand him a tool, and by early afternoon they had the wagon back at the homestead, propped up on blocks so he could properly assess the damage. "It is going to need a new wheel and tire," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "The spokes I might be able to salvage and carve replacements for, but the rim is bent past saving. You will need to send to Larkspur for a wheelwright, or I could try my hand at it if you trust me with the work." "Do you know wheelwrighting on top of everything else?" Violet asked, arms crossed, though there was less suspicion in her voice now than there had been the day before. "I know enough of most things a man needs on the frontier," Clement said. "Blacksmithing, carpentry, a little doctoring for animals and men both, when there is no one better around to do it. I have moved around a great deal these past years. A man picks up skills when he has got no place calling him home and plenty of time on his hands." There was something in the way he said it, home, that made Violet pause. She thought of asking him more about where he had come from, why a man with such clear competence and clear decency was drifting alone through the territory with no destination fixed in mind. But it did not feel like her place to ask, not yet, not when they had known each other less than a full day. "I have got a little money set aside," she said instead. "Not much, but enough to pay a fair wage if you are willing to stay on a few days and see to the wheel, and maybe the roof of the barn too, which has been leaking since the spring thaw. I lost my hired man back in the summer. He took work on a ranch further north that paid better than I could offer, and I have been managing on my own since." Clement looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened, though whether it was pity or simple understanding, Violet could not say and did not want to examine too closely. "I would be glad of the work, Mrs. Lawson," he said, "and glad of the company too, if I am honest. Been a long while since I sat at a table with anyone." She showed him where he could set up in the barn, and that evening, after supper, she found him out on the porch rather than inside the barn where she had expected him to retire. He was sitting on the top step, looking out at the darkening land, a cup of coffee in his hands that she had given him after the meal. "You are welcome to sleep inside in Samuel's old room if the barn does not suit," she offered, standing in the doorway. "It has been sitting empty since he got big enough to want his own space in the loft." "The barn suits me fine," Clement said. "Truth is, I like the porch better than any room. Man can see the whole sky from a porch. Been sleeping under open sky more nights than not these past years. Feels strange to be closed up in walls." Violet leaned against the doorframe, considering him. "You are a strange kind of drifter, Mr. Rhodes. Most men passing through do not stop to fix wheels and cut wood for strangers." "Maybe I am tired of passing through," he said quietly, not looking at her, looking instead at the horizon where the last light was fading behind the mountains. "Maybe a man gets to a point where he wants a porch to sit on that is not his own, just to remember what it might feel like to have one." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and after a moment she bid him good night and went inside, leaving him there on the porch step with his coffee and his thoughts, the first stars coming out cold and bright above the Wyoming plains. 3 days turned into a week, and the week turned into 2. Clement fixed the wagon wheel with careful, patient hands, carving new spokes from seasoned oak he found in Violet's small stand of trees near the creek, and fitting them so well that the wagon rolled smoother than it had in years. He patched the barn roof, mended the corral fence, and helped Violet bring in the last of her modest harvest before the first real frost, working alongside her in the fields with the sleeves of his shirt rolled up and sweat on his brow, never once complaining about the labor. Samuel had taken to following him around like a shadow, peppering him with questions about horses and cattle and the war, and Clement answered what he could, gently deflecting the questions about the fighting itself, though he did tell the boy stories about the great cattle drives up from Texas, the wide rivers they had crossed, the stampedes he had survived, the time he had roped a wolf that had been harrying a herd rather than shoot it, because bullets were dear and rope was cheap. Violet found herself watching the two of them together more often than she meant to, something warm and unfamiliar stirring in her chest each time she saw Samuel laugh at one of Clement's stories, each time she saw the boy's face light up in a way it had not since before his father died. Thomas Lawson had been a good man, steady and kind, but he had never had much time for stories or foolishness, always focused on the work of building something lasting out of the unforgiving land. Violet had loved him for his steadiness, had grieved him with a grief so total it had nearly broken her, but she was honest enough with herself to admit that Samuel had needed something Thomas had never quite given him, even alive, and that Clement Rhodes seemed to offer it without even trying. It was on an evening in early October, the air sharp with the first real bite of coming winter, that Violet finally asked him the question that had been sitting unspoken between them for 2 weeks. They were on the porch again, as had become their habit after Samuel went to bed, Violet with a mending basket in her lap and Clement whittling a small figure of a horse from a scrap of wood, a gift he said he intended for Samuel. "You have never told me why you are out here," Violet said, not looking up from her sewing. "A man does not drift through the territory for years with no destination unless he is running from something or looking for something. Which is it, Mr. Rhodes?" Clement's knife stilled against the wood. For a long moment he did not answer, and Violet thought perhaps she had overstepped, asked for more than he was willing to give. "Both, I suppose," he said finally. "I fought 4 years in the war back east, and I saw things there I do not care to speak of, things that changed a man in ways he cannot ever fully change back. When it ended, I went home to Missouri thinking I would settle, find a wife, build something. There was a woman there, Sarah was her name. We were engaged to be married before I ever went to fight. She waited for me the whole war, wrote me letters near every week." He paused, running his thumb along the edge of the half-carved horse. "I came home in the spring of '65 and found her already 6 months in the ground. Fever took her the winter before, while I was still marching. Nobody had thought to get word to me, or the letter never found me, I never rightly knew which. I stood at her grave and I did not know what to do with all the years I had planned to spend with her. So I started walking west and I just never stopped. Worked cattle, worked mines, worked whatever paid enough to keep moving. Never had a place feel like it wanted me to stay, not until now. Violet's hands had gone still in her lap. She thought of her own grief, the long nights after Thomas died when she had wondered how she would ever find reason to rise from bed each morning. And she understood, in a way words could not fully capture, the particular shape of the loss he carried. "I am sorry," she said softly. "That is a heavy thing to carry alone all these years." "I do not feel so alone as I did," Clement said, glancing up at her then, and something passed between them in that look, quiet and searching, that made Violet's breath catch in her throat. "Not since your wheel broke on that road, Mrs. Lawson." She looked away first, busying herself with her mending, though her heart was beating faster than the moment seemed to warrant. "You should not say such things to a widow only 2 years out from mourning, Mr. Rhodes." "I do not say it to trouble you," he said, "only to be honest. I have not felt easy sitting anywhere in 13 years, not until I sat on this porch." She did not answer him that night, and he did not push further, and they sat together in a silence that was not uncomfortable but full of something new and fragile that neither of them yet had a name for. The trouble, when it came, arrived on horseback on a cold morning in late October, in the shape of a man named Silas Crane. Crane owned the largest ranch in the valley, several thousand acres of grazing land that bordered Violet's modest 160 acres on the eastern side, and he had made no secret over the past 2 years of his interest in acquiring her land as well, offering at various points to buy her out for a price she knew to be far below its worth, always framing the offer as a kindness to a struggling widow, who surely could not manage alone. He rode up that morning with 2 of his hired men trailing behind him, and Violet met him in the yard with Samuel's hand held firmly in her own, keeping the boy close. "Mrs. Lawson," Crane said, tipping his hat with a smile that never reached his eyes. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, expensively dressed for a rancher, with a thick mustache and small, calculating eyes. "I heard you have got a hired man now. Didn't expect that, given your circumstances." "Mr. Rhodes has been kind enough to help with some repairs," Violet said evenly. "What can I do for you, Mr. Crane?" "Came to renew my offer, actually," Crane said, glancing around at the small but well-kept homestead with an appraising eye. "Bank notes are due again come spring, and I know how tight things run for a widow alone. I would take this place off your hands for $800, cash money, more than fair for land this size, and you and the boy could move into town, live comfortable." "This land is not for sale," Violet said. "It never has been, and I do not expect that to change." Crane's smile thinned. "A woman alone out here, no husband, no real protection beyond a drifter you took in off the road, that is a precarious position, Mrs. Lawson. Things happen to lone homesteads. Fences get cut, cattle wander onto land they should not, fires start from careless sparks. I would hate to see something happen to this place before you had the sense to accept a fair offer." It was at that moment that Clement stepped out from the barn, having heard the exchange, and walked across the yard with an unhurried but purposeful stride that made Crane's 2 hired men shift uneasily in their saddles. "That sounded very near a threat, Mr. Crane," Clement said, coming to stand beside Violet, his voice calm but with an edge beneath it that had not been there in any conversation Violet had heard from him before. "I would think a man of your standing would not want to be heard making threats against a widow and her boy in front of witnesses." Crane's eyes flicked over Clement, taking his measure, and something in what he saw there made him a fraction less certain than he had been a moment before. "I do not know who you are, mister, but this is not your business. I am staying on to help Mrs. Lawson with her land, which she has told you plainly is not for sale," Clement said. "That makes it my business, same as it would be any decent man's business to stand beside a neighbor being pressured. I fought 4 years in a war so men would not have to bow to threats and bullying, Mr. Crane. I did not come out west to watch it happen anyway." For a long moment the 2 men regarded each other, the tension in the yard thick enough that Samuel pressed closer against his mother's skirts, Then Crane laughed, a short, humorless sound, and turned his horse. "You are a fool if you think a hired drifter's word means anything against a man with my holdings, Mrs. Lawson," he called back as he rode off, his men falling in behind him. "The offer stands until spring. After that, do not come crying to me when the bank forecloses and you have got nothing at all." They watched him go, the dust from his horse's hooves settling slowly back onto the road, and Violet realized her hands were shaking. "He has been at this for 2 years," she said quietly. "Ever since Thomas died. I do not know how I am going to keep making the note payments, not with the harvest as poor as it was this year. I have been managing, but managing is not the same as thriving. Mr. Rhodes and men like Crane can smell weakness the way wolves smell blood." "Then we will not show him weakness," Clement said simply. "I will help you get through the winter, and in the spring we will figure out the note together. You are not facing this alone anymore, Violet." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something about the way he said it, plain and sure, settled a fear in her chest that had been sitting there for 2 years. Ever since the day they had buried Thomas and she had understood, fully and finally, that she was on her own. Winter came hard that year, as it often did in the high plains, with snow piling deep against the north side of the barn by mid-November and temperatures that dropped so low, the water trough had to be broken with an axe each morning before the horses could drink. Clement had built himself a proper bunk in a corner of the barn, insisting it suited him better than being closed up in the house, though he took his meals with Violet and Samuel each day, and the three of them fell into a rhythm that felt, to Violet's growing unease and growing joy both, uncomfortably close to the shape of a family. There were quiet evenings by the fire when Clement told Samuel more stories, taught him how to whittle, showed him the proper way to oil a saddle and mend a bridle. There were harder days, too, days when the wind howled so fierce across the plains that none of them dared venture far from the house, days when Violet caught herself simply watching Clement across the small room, the firelight catching the planes of his face, and had to look away before he noticed, and before she had to reckon with what she was feeling. She told herself it was too soon. She told herself Thomas deserved more than 2 years of mourning before she let herself feel this way about another man. But grief, she was learning, did not work on a schedule, and some nights she lay awake in her bed listening to the wind and thinking of Clement Rhodes out in the barn, wondering if he was warm enough, wondering if he was thinking of her too. The turning point came in late December, during a blizzard that struck without warning on a morning that had begun clear and cold. Violet had gone out to check on the chickens, thinking she had time before the weather turned, but the storm rolled in fast and hard, the wind picking up so suddenly, and the snow coming so thick that within minutes she could barely see the barn from where she stood in the yard. She started back toward the house, disoriented by the white swirling chaos around her, and it was only Clement's voice, shouting her name against the wind, that gave her a direction to move toward. He found her halfway across the yard, snow already caked thick on her shawl, and pulled her against him, wrapping his coat around both of them as he guided her the rest of the way to the house. Inside, with the door barred against the storm and Samuel safely tucked by the fire where Mrs. Perkins, who had been staying with them through the worst of the storm season, was reading him a story, Violet found herself still pressed close against Clement, both of them breathing hard from the cold and the fear. "You could have died out there," Clement said, his voice rough, his hands still gripping her shoulders as though he could not quite make himself let go. "A man loses his way in a storm like that. He does not always find it again." "I know," Violet said, looking up at him, snow still melting in her hair. "I have lived here 5 years, Clement. I know how quick a storm can take a person." "I could not bear it," he said quietly, and his voice cracked slightly on the words. "I could not bear losing another person to weather I did not see coming. Not you, Violet, not after everything." And then, before either of them had fully decided to let it happen, he was kissing her, gentle and searching, his cold hands framing her face, and Violet was kissing him back, 2 years of loneliness and grief and careful walls all coming down at once in the warm, fire-lit room while the storm howled outside. They broke apart after a long moment, both of them a little breathless, and Violet saw in his eyes something that looked almost like fear. "I did not mean to do that without asking," Clement said. "I do not want you to think I have been working your land these months with some notion of taking more than was offered." "Clement," Violet said, and she found she was smiling, something warm blooming in her chest that she had not felt in 2 long years. "I think if I had not wanted you to kiss me, I would have stepped away rather more quickly than I did." He laughed then, real and surprised, and reached up to brush a bit of melting snow from her cheek. "I have been trying to tell myself for weeks now that I was only staying on to help with the wheel and the harvest," he said. "But the truth is I have not wanted to leave this porch since the first night I sat on it, Violet Lawson. I think I have known for some time now that it was not the wheel that was keeping me here." From the front room, Mrs. Perkins cleared her throat rather loudly, and Violet realized with a flush of embarrassment that the older woman had likely seen the whole thing, and Samuel too, peering around the doorframe with wide, curious eyes. "Are you going to marry Mama?" Samuel asked, with the blunt directness only a child could manage, and both Violet and Clement laughed despite themselves, the tension of the moment breaking into something lighter and sweeter. "That is between your Mama and me, young man," Clement said, "but I will say I would like nothing better if she would have me." Violet felt her cheeks warm further, but she did not deny it, and later that night, after Samuel was asleep and Mrs. Perkins had retired to the small guest room, Violet and Clement sat together by the dying fire and talked long into the night about what a future together might look like, about the note due to the bank in the spring, about Crane's threats, about whether two people who had each lost so much dared risk loving again. "I loved Thomas," Violet said quietly at one point, staring into the embers. "I do not want you to think that what I feel for you erases that. It does not. But I think perhaps a heart can hold more than one love in a lifetime if it is given the chance." "I would never ask you to forget him," Clement said. "Sarah is part of who I am too, same as Thomas is part of who you are. I think maybe that is why we understand each other the way we do. We have both learned that losing someone does not mean you stop having room to love again. It just means you carry them with you while you do it." Violet reached over and took his hand, rough and calloused from months of hard work on her land, and held it in both of hers. "Then I think," she said slowly, "that I would like very much to marry you, Clement Rhodes, if you are certain that is what you want, but I will not pretend the road ahead is easy. There is still the bank note, and Crane will not give up easily, and winter is not done with us yet." "I have faced harder roads with less reason to keep walking them," Clement said, lifting her hand to his lips. "I will face this one gladly, so long as I get to face it beside you." They did not marry that winter, both of them agreeing it was wise to wait until spring, until the note situation with the bank was settled, and until enough time had passed that the town of Larkspur would not have cause to gossip too harshly about a widow remarrying so soon after taking in a hired hand. But they did not hide their affection either, not from Samuel, who took to the idea with the easy joy of a child who had missed having a father's presence in the house, and not from Mrs. Perkins, who despite her earlier suspicions had come to regard Clement with clear approval, often remarking that she had not seen Violet smile so freely since before Thomas passed. Word reached Larkspur, as word always did in small territorial towns, and by the time the first thaw came in March, most of the town knew that the widow Lawson had a beau, a drifter-turned-rancher's helper named Clement Rhodes, who had, by all accounts, worked harder on her land than any hired man they had known, and had done it, seemingly, for love rather than wages. Silas Crane heard the news as well, and it did not sit easy with him. He had spent 2 years counting on Violet's isolation and vulnerability to eventually force her hand, and the arrival of a capable, protective man on her land had thrown a wrench into whatever plans he had been quietly making. In late March, With the note payment due within the month and Violet still short of the full amount despite a winter of careful saving, Crane made his move. He arrived at the bank in Larkspur before Violet did, and by the time she and Clement rode into town together to make the partial payment she had managed to scrape together, along with a letter requesting an extension on the remainder, they found the bank manager, a nervous, thin man named Mr. Abernathy, already looking uncomfortable behind his desk. "Mrs. Lawson," Abernathy said, not quite meeting her eyes, "I am afraid the situation has changed somewhat. Mr. Crane came to see me this morning and he has purchased your note outright from the bank. The full amount is now owed directly to him, and he has indicated he does not intend to extend the terms." Violet felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her feet. "He cannot do that. Can he do that?" "It is within his rights, unfortunately," Abernathy said. "The bank was glad enough to be rid of the risk, given the poor harvest this past year across the whole valley. Mr. Crane paid the note in full, and now holds it himself. He has given you until the end of the month to pay the remaining $400, or the land reverts to him as collateral, per the original terms you signed with your late husband." Clement's jaw had tightened beside her, and Violet could feel the anger radiating off him, controlled but present. "That land has been in Mrs. Lawson's family 5 years," Clement said. "Crane is doing this deliberately, to force her hand where he could not force it through fair offers." "I understand your frustration, Mr. Rhodes," Abernathy said, "but the transaction is entirely legal. I am sorry. There is nothing further I can do." They left the bank in grim silence, and it was not until they were back on the road toward home that Violet finally spoke, her voice tight with barely controlled fear. $400, Clement. I do not have anything close to that. I have maybe $60 saved, and even if we sold every animal we own, we would not reach half of what he is demanding." "We are not going to lose this land," Clement said, though his voice carried more determination than certainty. "There has got to be a way." That way, when it came, arrived from an unexpected direction 3 days later, in the form of a letter that reached Clement through the Larkspur post office, forwarded from an address in Missouri he had left standing instructions with years before, in case anyone from his old life ever needed to reach him. The letter was from a lawyer handling the estate of Clement's father, who had died the previous autumn, leaving behind a modest farm in Missouri that Clement, as the only surviving son, was entitled to inherit or to sell. Clement had not spoken to his father in years, their relationship strained since before the war, and he read the letter twice through with an unreadable expression before handing it to Violet. "I have not thought of that farm in a decade," he said. "Did not even know my father had passed. We were not close, not since I came home from the war and told him I could not stay, that I needed to keep moving. I think he never forgave me for leaving Sarah's grave behind, though I do not know what he thought I should have done, stood there and withered alongside her memory." "Clement," Violet said gently, "this could be the answer. If the farm can be sold, I know what it could mean," he said. "I am only trying to make peace with the notion of profiting from a father who I do not think ever much like the man I became." It took nearly 3 weeks of letters going back and forth, and a fair amount of anxious waiting, but by the 3rd week of April, word came through the lawyer that the Missouri farm had sold to a neighboring family for $1,100, a fair price for the land and modest house upon it. The money would take time to arrive properly, transferred through banks in Missouri and then to the Territorial Bank in Cheyenne, but the lawyer was able to advance a portion immediately upon the sale's completion, understanding the urgency Clement had described in his letters. $450 arrived by secure transport to the Larkspur Bank on the 28th of April, 2 days before Crane's deadline, and Violet and Clement rode into town together to settle the note in full, watching with quiet satisfaction as Abernathy processed the payment and marked the deed clear of any claim. Crane heard the news within the day, and he rode out to the homestead one final time, his face dark with frustrated anger, though he kept his voice civil in front of Samuel, who was playing in the yard. "You got lucky, Rhodes," Crane said, not bothering to dismount. "I do not know where the money came from, and I do not much care, but do not think this is the last time our interests will cross in this valley. I still mean to expand my grazing land, and I will find other ways to do it." "You will find no more purchase here, Mr. Crane," Clement said evenly, standing on the porch steps with his arm now comfortable and natural around Violet's shoulders. "This is our home, mine and Violet's and Samuel's, and it is not for sale, not now, not later, not for any price you care to name. I would suggest you look elsewhere for your ambitions, because you will find nothing but a fair fight waiting for you here, and I do not lose those easily." Crane's eyes moved between them, taking in the sight of the three of them together on the porch, a family in every way but the formal one, and something in his expression shifted, the calculation of a man recognizing a battle not worth continuing to wage. "Fine," he said finally, tugging his hat down. "Keep your 160 acres, Rhodes. I have got bigger land to worry about than a widow's homestead anyway." He rode off and did not return again, and though Violet knew enough of men like Crane to understand he might yet cause trouble in other ways, in other corners of the valley, she felt for the first time in 2 years that her home, her son's future, and her own heart were finally, truly secure. They were married on the 15th of May in the small white church in Larkspur, with Reverend Whitfield presiding over a ceremony attended by most of the town, curious and warm in equal measure, toward the widow who had found love again with the quiet stranger who had first appeared fixing her broken wagon wheel on the road home. Violet wore a dress of pale blue calico that Mrs. Perkins had helped her sew, simple but pretty, with wildflowers gathered by Samuel woven through her dark hair. Clement stood at the front of the church in a borrowed suit that fit him well enough, his scarred face open, and unguarded in a way Violet had rarely seen it, watching her walk down the aisle on the arm of old Mr. Perkins, who had offered to give her away in the absence of any living family of her own. Samuel stood at the front as well, having insisted on his own important role in the ceremony, carrying the ring on a small velvet cushion with the serious dedication of a boy who understood in his own way that his mother's happiness and his own were bound up together in this moment. "Clement Rhodes," Reverend Whitfield said, "do you take Violet Lawson to be your lawful wife, to love and to cherish in sickness and in health, for so long as you both shall live?" "I do," Clement said, his voice steady but thick with emotion, his eyes never leaving Violet's face. "I have looked for a place to call home for 13 years, Reverend, and I did not understand until I met this woman that a home is not a place at all. It is a person. I take Violet gladly, and I will spend every day I have got left proving myself worthy of her trust." "Violet Lawson," the Reverend continued, "do you take Clement Rhodes to be your lawful husband, to love and to cherish in sickness and in health, for so long as you both shall live?" "I do," Violet said, smiling through tears she made no effort to hide. "I thought when I lost Thomas that I had used up all the love I had to give, that grief had hollowed me out too much to ever be filled again. Clement Rhodes proved me wrong the moment he knelt down beside my broken wheel and did not ask for anything in return but a chance to help. I take him, and I promise to build with him whatever this life has left to offer us." They were pronounced husband and wife to the sound of applause and a few tears from the gathered townsfolk, and Samuel, standing at the front with his ring cushion now empty, whooped loudly enough that it drew laughter through the whole church, breaking the solemnity of the moment into something joyful and warm. The celebration afterward was held in the churchyard, tables set up with food brought by half the women of Larkspur, fiddle music striking up as the afternoon wore on into a soft golden evening. Violet danced with Clement beneath the cottonwood trees, her hand in his, her head resting against his chest as the fiddle player worked through a slow waltz, and she thought, with a fullness of heart she had not known in years, that this was what it felt like to have a future again, not merely a past to mourn. They returned to the homestead that evening as husband and wife, and Clement, true to the promise he had made all those months before on that first stormy night, finally moved his few belongings from the barn into the house itself, though he laughed as he did it, remarking that he supposed even a man who loved sleeping under open sky could make an exception for the woman who had given him a reason to want walls again. The years that followed were not without their hardships, as no years on the frontier ever truly were. There was a drought the summer after their wedding that tested every homestead in the valley, and Clement worked from dawn until dusk hauling water from the creek to keep their small herd of cattle alive, while Violet managed the garden with a careful, rationed hand that kept them fed through the leanest months. There was a scare the following winter when Samuel, now 9, fell through thin ice on the creek while playing and had to be pulled out by Clement, who plunged in without hesitation despite the freezing water, an act that left him laid up with a fever for a week, but that cemented, in Samuel's young heart, a devotion to his stepfather that would last a lifetime. Silas Crane did eventually find other ambitions to occupy his greed, expanding his ranch northward rather than east, and though he and Clement never became friends, they settled into the wary, distant civility of neighbors who had learned to leave each other be. The valley grew over the following years, more homesteaders arriving as the railroad extended its reach further into the territory, and Larkspur grew from a small crossroads town into something more substantial, with a proper schoolhouse built in 1881 that Samuel attended alongside a growing number of other children whose families had come west seeking the same promise of land and opportunity that had first brought Thomas and Violet Lawson to that valley years before. In the spring of 1880, Violet gave birth to a son, whom they named Thomas Clement Rhodes, honoring both the man who had first built the porch where so much of their love had taken root, and the man who had finished building the life meant to be lived upon it. Clement held the infant in his rough, calloused hands the night he was born, sitting on that very porch beneath a sky thick with stars, and wept openly for the first time since Sarah's death 15 years before, though these were tears of joy rather than grief, the particular relief of a man who had finally, after so many years of wandering, found a place and a family that were entirely his own. 2 years after that, a daughter followed, whom they named Sarah Grace, a quiet acknowledgement from Clement to Violet of the woman he had lost so long ago, a way of carrying her memory forward not as a wound, but as a blessing passed on to new life. Violet had wept when he suggested the name, understanding fully the significance of what he offered in trusting her with it, and she had held their daughter close that first night and whispered a promise that the girl would grow up knowing she was named for love, not loss. Samuel grew into a fine young man under Clement's steady guidance, learning ranching and carpentry and all the practical skills a frontier life demanded, but also learning, through the example set daily on that homestead, what it meant to build a life on partnership and respect rather than mere survival. By the time he was 17, he had grown taller than Clement himself, though he still sought his stepfather's counsel on every important matter, and the bond between them, forged that first stormy autumn when Clement had told stories by the fire to a grieving boy who needed something to believe in, never wavered through all the years that followed. The porch itself, the one Thomas Lawson had built with such care all those years before, saying every woman deserved somewhere to watch the sunset, remained the heart of the homestead through every season that followed. It was expanded twice as the family grew, first when Thomas Clement was born and they added a swing for the children, and again when Sarah Grace grew old enough to want her own space to sit and dream, a small bench built by Clement's own hands at the porch's far end, carved with wildflowers to match the ones Violet had worn in her hair on their wedding day. It was on that porch, many years later on an evening in the autumn of 1898, that Violet and Clement sat together as an older married couple, gray now threading through both their heads, watching their grandchildren play in the yard where Samuel's own children, and Thomas Clement's new bride, and Sarah Grace's betrothed, a young schoolteacher from Cheyenne, all gathered for a family supper that had become a weekly tradition as the homestead had grown into something of a gathering place for the whole extended family the years had given them. "Do you remember," Violet said, resting her head against Clement's shoulder as she had done 1,000 times over the past 20 years, "how frightened I was that first night, riding home behind a stranger on his horse, not knowing what kind of man you were?" "I remember," Clement said, taking her hand in his, the same steady, calloused hand that had first offered to help her 20 years before. "I remember thinking I had never seen anyone so determined to hide her fear behind good sense. Took my breath clean away, if I am honest, though I did not let myself think much on it that first night, seemed improper somehow. And now look at us," Violet said, gesturing toward the yard full of family, the laughter of grandchildren carrying on the evening air, the smell of supper cooking inside the house that had grown twice over the years to accommodate their family's needs. "A broken wheel, Clement. That is all it took to change the whole course of both our lives." "I do not think it was only the wheel," Clement said, turning to look at her, his eyes still holding that same quiet warmth she had first noticed on the road all those years ago. "I think perhaps it was two people who had each lost so much, finding in each other exactly what they had stopped believing they would ever find again. The wheel just gave us the reason to stop and notice." Violet smiled, leaning up to press a soft kiss against his weathered cheek, the scar there long since faded to little more than a pale line, a mark from a war that had once nearly taken everything from him before it had, in its strange and roundabout way, led him to her broken wagon on a lonely stretch of Wyoming road. "I am glad my wheel broke, Clement Rhodes," she said softly. "I am glad every single day that it broke exactly when and where it did." "So am I, Violet," he said, wrapping his arm around her as the sun set golden over the mountains behind them, the same mountains that had watched over every season of their life together since that first stormy autumn evening. "So am I." The porch light burned warm against the coming dusk, and the family gathered close as the stars began to emerge overhead. And in that peaceful Wyoming evening, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and the steady, hard-won love that had grown between them across 2 decades of shared hardship and shared joy, Violet Lawson Rhodes and Clement Rhodes sat together exactly where they had first begun, on a porch that had never stopped being home, for either of them. Since the night a stranger's horse had first carried a frightened widow safely through the storm. They lived out the remainder of their days on that same homestead, the land eventually passing down through Samuel's line and then through his children after him. The little house grown large through additions and improvements over the decades, but the original porch always kept intact, a monument neither of them ever spoke of needing to preserve, but which somehow, through some unspoken agreement between them, was never altered, never torn down, never replaced. Visitors to the valley in later years, and there were many as the territory achieved statehood in 1890, and the railroad brought increasing numbers of settlers through Larkspur, would sometimes hear the story from old-timers in the saloon or the general store, the tale of the widow whose broken wagon had brought a stranger to her door, a stranger who had never quite managed to leave her porch again, not for the rest of his natural life. It became something of a local legend, embellished here and there in the retelling, though the heart of it always remained true. That love, even after loss so deep it seemed unsurvivable, could find its way back to a person willing to let it in, sometimes arriving in the most unexpected form, on the most ordinary of roads, carried by nothing more dramatic than a broken wheel and a stranger's willingness to stop and help. Clement Rhodes died peacefully in the spring of 1911, at the age of 63, in the same bedroom where each of his children had been born, with Violet holding his hand and Samuel and Thomas Clement and Sarah Grace all gathered close around him. His last words, according to those present, were a quiet thanks, spoken to Violet for the porch, and for everything that had followed from it. Violet lived on another 6 years after that, surrounded always by family, by grandchildren who grew up hearing the story of their grandparents' love told and retold at every family gathering, a tale that never grew old in the telling because it had been, from its very first chapter on that lonely storm-threatened road, a true and complete thing. A story of two broken people finding in each other exactly the mending they had each stopped believing they deserved. She was buried beside Clement in the small cemetery outside Larkspur, beneath a headstone that bore both their names and a single carved wagon wheel between them, a symbol chosen by Samuel to honor the strange and humble beginning of a love that had, in the end, proven as sturdy and lasting as anything built on that Wyoming land, weathering every storm the frontier had thrown at it, and emerging each time only stronger, only more certain of the home it had found in itself. The homestead stands today, in the memory of that valley's oldest families, as a reminder that even in a land as hard and unforgiving as the American frontier once was, love could take root in the most unlikely soil, could grow from something as small and ordinary as a broken wheel on a lonely road, and could last, faithfully and completely, for every single day that followed, right up until the very end, and beyond it too. In the stories told by children and grandchildren who carried that love forward into futures neither Violet Lawson nor Clement Rhodes could have imagined on that first stormy autumn evening, when a stranger's horse carried a frightened widow safely home through the rain, and never, in all the years that followed, truly left her porch again.